Now, a US contractor has been killed in an attack on an Iraqi military base. Several rockets were fired into the base near Kirkuk that houses both Iraqi and US troops. Several service personnel were also injured. Simona Foltyn has more from Baghdad on that attack.
Well, this attack occurred last night. It was several rockets that hit inside the K1 military base, which houses both U.S. forces as well as Iraqi forces. And this base is used to launch important operations against ISIL, who have staged an insurgency in the surrounding mountains. Now, this is just the latest in a spate of similar rocket attacks, but it's the first time that we're actually seeing U.S. casualties. There has not been any responsibility attributed to this, but unofficially one member of the U.S. coalition told me that it bears similar hallmarks to previous attacks which were attributed to the Iranian-backed armed group Kataib Hezbollah. Now, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said on December 13th that any such attacks would be met with decisive force. So it remains to be seen whether following these U.S. casualties there will actually be such a response. And of course, this raises great concerns here in Iraq because it's supposed to be the Iraqi government to actually protect U.S. forces based here. And the government did promise an investigation, but on the part of U.S. forces, they simply feel that with the increase of such attacks, they may need to protect themselves. And of course, there is a real risk that should the U.S. respond, there could be an escalation here on the ground between U.S. forces and Iranian-backed armed groups.
Rodger Shanahan's with us now on Skype from Sydney. He is a research fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy. Rodger, just to build on what Simona was saying, and without stating the obvious, this does escalate things, isn't it? Rocket attacks, sustained rocket attacks are one thing, but when a US contractor loses their life, it ups the stakes.
Certainly, and I think there'll be a lot riding on the investigation or the inquiry that US forces will be doing inside Iraq, because that will obviously determine the next steps that US authorities are going to have to take, whether they follow up on Secretary of State Pompeo's threats or whether they're able to attribute this to Islamic State or whether it's indeterminate. But the investigation is really the next step in this matter.
Regardless of who's behind it, is it or are they capitalising on a moment of weakness? Because the protests have really taken over Iraq for the last few months. The political situation's no better either. The country, after so many years of being vulnerable, seems even more vulnerable.
Well, again, we're going to have to determine who launched this rocket attack. It's obviously pursuing the interests of Islamic State. It's also potentially pursuing the interests of Iranian-backed militia forces in Iraq as well. So the motives behind a potential attack are common to both threat groups for the Americans. So really, it's a large US target to attack. And so we're really going to have to wait until we've got a bit more information from the US authorities about this one.
But still, just to build on this point about, and I guess this is more widely talking about Iraq, the weakness in the country at the moment. Can you see any obvious way out, or something which will strengthen the government, which will strengthen the people's belief in their leaders?
Well, as you point out, a well-functioning government with the full control over security within the country would make these kind of attacks, if not impossible, then very difficult to undertake. And we've seen a ratcheting up in the number of attacks directed against US targets in particular from Iranian-backed militia groups in Iran. Until we get some kind of solution to Iraq's political problem that is acceptable to the population in general, until we get a reduction in the degree of corruption in Iraqi politics, until we get some kind of unity in the country, the reality is that you're going to have to expect more fracturing around the edges as we've seen to date.
Rodger Shanahan joining us from Sydney, talking about the latest situation in Iraq. Thank you, Rodger. Do appreciate that.
My pleasure.